The boy had been staring at two Christmas trees for nearly 20 minutes when he finally said, "My mom always knew which one was ours." I was carrying a bundle of red ribbon across Parker family trees when I heard him, and something in the quiet certainty of his voice made me stop. It was the first Saturday in December, cold enough that every breath turned white. The tree lot was crowded with families weaving between rows of Fraser firs while Christmas music played softly from an old speaker near the checkout shed. The air smelled like pine needles, hot chocolate, and the cinnamon donuts my aunt insisted on selling every December. I was only supposed to be helping her for the weekend. Instead, I found myself watching an 8-year-old boy stand between two trees as if he'd been given the most important decision of his life. He wore a navy winter coat, knitted gloves, and a red scarf. In each hand, he held a short piece of red ribbon we gave customers to mark trees they wanted to buy. "Having trouble deciding?" I asked. He looked up at me with serious blue eyes. "Maybe. That sounds like yes." He considered this. "They're both good." I set my bundle of ribbon on a nearby table. "That's definitely a problem." He pointed toward the first Fraser fir. It was nearly 7 feet tall, perfectly symmetrical, with dense green branches. "That one looks like a Christmas tree in a commercial." Strong argument. Then he pointed toward the second. It was shorter, maybe 6.5 feet, and leaned slightly to the left. One side had an unusual gap between the branches. "But that one feels better." "Feels better?" I don't know how to explain it. I crouched beside the tree, pretending to inspect it with professional seriousness. "Well, this one has personality." The boy frowned. "It's crooked." Personality is sometimes crooked. That earned the smallest smile. "What's your name?" I asked. "Mason." "I'm Ryan. And for the record, Mason, I think choosing a Christmas tree has very little to do with finding the perfect one." "Then how do you choose?" I looked around at the families carrying trees toward their cars. Parents called after each other. Couples argued cheerfully. Over height, strings of warm bulbs glowed above the rows of evergreens. "You pick the one you can imagine in your house." Mason turned back toward the crooked tree. "Mom used to know." "Was she really good at picking them?" He nodded. "Every year. Dad always picked the biggest one, and Mom told him it wouldn't fit." I laughed. "Did she win?" "Every time." His smile appeared again, but there was something underneath it now. Something I didn't understand yet. Mason stepped closer to the second tree and touched one of its branches. "She liked trees with spaces." "Why?" "For the big ornaments." He pointed to the gap. "That's where she'd put the special ones." Suddenly, the imperfect tree made sense. "Then I think this one's making a pretty convincing argument." Mason stared at it for another few seconds before tying one of his red ribbons around a branch. "This one. Decision made?" "Decision made." I expected him to call toward whichever adult had brought him, but instead he stayed beside me. "Do you think it's weird?" he asked. "What?" "Picking the tree she would have picked." "No." I shook my head. "I think remembering what somebody loved can be a pretty good way to keep a tradition going." Mason studied my face as though deciding whether I really meant it. Then he looked back at the tree. "Mom would have picked this one." Before I could respond, a man's voice called from the next row. "Mason." The boy turned immediately. I stood and saw a tall man step around a line of Fraser firs. He looked about mid-30s, dressed in a dark wool coat over a charcoal sweater, with brown hair slightly mussed from the wind and the same blue eyes as Mason. A phone was still in his hand. His expression showed relief when he saw the boy, followed almost immediately by confusion when he noticed me. "Dad, I found it," Mason announced. The man stopped beside us. "Found what?" "Our tree." Mason pointed proudly at the crooked Fraser fir. "Ryan helped me." The man's gaze moved from Mason to me. "Ryan." "Ryan Parker." I offered a polite smile. "I'm helping run the lot." Something in his expression shifted. "Parker." He glanced toward the checkout shed. "Your family owns this place?" "My aunt does. I'm the seasonal free labor." He gave the faintest smile. "We've bought trees here before. Emily used to get wreaths from your aunt every December." That surprised me. Then apparently our families have been doing business longer than we have. "Daniel Brooks." He nodded toward Mason. "I was right by the checkout taking a work call. I could see him until he moved one row over." Mason looked entirely unapologetic. "I was choosing." Daniel sighed. "You could have told me you were moving. I was only over here." "I know." Daniel put a hand briefly on his son's shoulder. "I just like knowing where you are." Then Mason pointed again. "Look at the tree." Daniel did. The moment he saw it, something changed in his face. His eyes settled on the wide space between the branches, and the tension seemed to leave him at once, replaced by something quieter. A Fraser fir, he murmured. Mason nodded. Like Mom picked. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Christmas music continued behind us. People laughed somewhere near the hot chocolate stand. Snow began falling in tiny white flecks against his dark coat. Finally, Daniel reached out and touched the same branch Mason had touched. His mother always chose Fraser firs, he said quietly. That was when I understood why Mason had spoken about his mother entirely in the past tense. Daniel kept his hand on the branch for several seconds. I had the strange feeling that Mason and I had accidentally opened a door he had spent years keeping closed. Mason seemed less worried. He stepped around the tree, inspecting it from every angle as snow collected on his red scarf. It'll fit, he announced. Daniel finally looked at him. You measured the living room? No. Then how do you know? Because Mom would have known. Daniel smiled, but the smile carried a sadness that made me look away. I busied myself checking the tag tied near the trunk. 6 feet, 7 inches, I said. Unless your ceiling is unusually low, you should be safe. 9 feet, Daniel replied. I measured after our last tree nearly touched the ceiling. Mason grinned. Dad picked that one. I made one mistake. Mom said you picked trees like you were trying to fill a hotel lobby. I laughed before I could stop myself. Daniel looked mildly betrayed. I see you two have already formed an alliance. I'm neutral, I said. I sell trees to both sides. Mason pointed toward the crooked Fraser fir. We want this one. Daniel studied it again. Are you sure? Mason nodded. It has spaces. That simple answer seemed to settle something. Daniel reached for the price tag, then glanced at me. We'll take it. I untied Mason's red ribbon and handed it back to him before carrying the tree toward the wrapping station. Daniel immediately took the heavier end without being asked. Together, we guided it through the netting machine, while Mason followed beside us, holding both ribbons like trophies. You work here every Christmas? Daniel asked. Only when my aunt convinces me family loyalty means free labor. He complains. My aunt called from the checkout shed. But he comes back every year. Daniel laughed. So this isn't your regular job? I'm a graphic designer during the week. Trees are seasonal. And apparently counseling children through major evergreen decisions. That service costs extra. Mason looked alarmed. Dad, do we have to pay him more? Daniel and I both laughed. He's joking, Daniel said. Mostly, I added. My aunt shook her head from the shed. Ignore my nephew. The Parkers have been overcharging people emotionally for years. Daniel smiled at her. Emily would have agreed with you. My aunt's expression softened. I remember Emily. Daniel went still for half a second. My aunt didn't push. She simply handed him the receipt. She had excellent taste in wreaths. A small smile appeared on Daniel's face. She did. By the time we reached Daniel's dark blue SUV, the snowfall had grown steadier, dusting the parking lot in white. I helped lift the wrapped tree onto the roof rack, while Daniel secured it with 2 tie-down straps. He checked each strap twice. Then a third time. Architect. I guessed. He looked over the roof at me. How did you know? You've checked those straps enough times to qualify them for a building permit. Structural engineer would be more accurate for that stereotype. So you are an architect? Yes. Mason stood near the passenger door, watching us. Dad draws buildings and tells people where windows go. Daniel sighed. That's a painfully simplified description of my career. Do you tell them where Christmas trees go? I asked. Apparently, I've lost authority over Christmas trees. For the first time since he'd arrived, Daniel looked genuinely relaxed. Then Mason asked, Ryan, are you good at decorating? I leaned against the SUV. Depends who's judging. Christmas trees. I've decorated enough of them. Mason's face brightened. What about lights? Excellent with lights. Ornaments. Highly qualified. Daniel seemed to realize where the conversation was heading at the exact same moment I did. Mason, he said carefully. Mason ignored the warning. You should come decorate ours. Daniel closed his eyes for half a second. You can't invite people to our house without asking me first. Mason looked confused. I just asked Ryan. That's not the part you skipped. I tried to rescue him. Your dad's right. You two probably have your own Christmas traditions. Mason's excitement faded. He looked at the tree secured above us. Not anymore. Daniel became very still. Mason rubbed one red ribbon between his gloved fingers. We haven't had a real tree since Mom died. The cheerful sounds of the lot suddenly seemed farther away. Daniel looked toward his son, and I could see the conflict in his expression. "We don't have to decorate everything tonight," he said gently. "But we got the tree." "I know. And Ryan knows the lights." Daniel glanced at me, embarrassed. "I'm sorry. He's become extremely persuasive lately." "It's fine." He looked toward the checkout shed, then back at me. "At least you're not exactly a complete stranger." High praise. He almost smiled. "Emily knew your aunt. We've been buying from your family for years. And your aunt knows where we live," Mason added helpfully. Daniel gave him a look. "Thank you, Mason." I laughed. Daniel exhaled and looked toward the tree. Then back at me. "If you don't have plans tonight, you could come by for a little while." Mason's face lit up. "You really don't have to," Daniel added. "I know." That seemed to surprise him. Snow rested in his brown hair now, and for a moment neither of us said anything. Then I nodded. "Send me the address." Standing beneath strings of Christmas lights with snow falling around us, I had the unmistakable feeling that choosing one imperfect tree had just changed the direction of all 3 of our Decembers. By 6 that evening, I had convinced myself at least 4 times that accepting Daniel's invitation was still a strange idea. Then I found myself standing on his front porch anyway, holding a cardboard tray with 3 cups of hot chocolate and wondering when exactly my Saturday had stopped being ordinary. The Brooks house sat on a quiet residential street about 15 minutes from the tree lot. It was a 2-story Craftsman with dark green siding and warm light glowing through the front windows. Daniel's SUV was parked in the driveway. The Fraser fir was no longer on the roof. Before I could knock, the door opened. Mason stood there wearing a red sweater and an expression of absolute victory. "You came. You sound surprised. Dad said you might change your mind." A voice came from somewhere behind him. "That's not what I said." Daniel appeared in the hallway, now wearing the same charcoal sweater without his coat, his sleeves pushed slightly up his forearms. He looked more relaxed at home, although the uncertainty from the tree lot was still there. I said Ryan probably had other things to do, and I said he'd come. Mason pointed at the drinks in my hands. "He brought hot chocolate, so I win." Daniel stepped aside. "Apparently everything is a competition now. Come in." The house smelled faintly of pine because the Fraser fir was already standing in the living room near a wide front window. Without the netting around it, the tree looked fuller than it had at the lot. It still leaned slightly left. "It has character," Mason reminded me. "Exactly." Daniel closed the door behind me. "I've heard that phrase several times since we got home." I handed him one of the cups. "You're welcome." "For the hot chocolate or the permanent vocabulary change?" "Both." Mason carried his cup into the living room. That was when I noticed something unexpected. The tree was the only Christmas decoration in sight. No stockings hung from the fireplace. No garland crossed the mantel. No lights framed the windows. The room was comfortable and lived in, with books on the shelves and family photographs along one wall. But December seemed to have stopped at the front door. Daniel noticed me looking around. "We have decorations," he said. "They're in the basement." "All of them?" Mason asked. Daniel hesitated. "I think so." That hesitation told me more than the answer. We followed him downstairs to a finished basement where several storage shelves lined one wall. Daniel stood in front of them for a moment before reaching toward 3 large cardboard boxes on the top shelf. Dust covered the lids. He brought the first one down carefully. Written across the side in black marker were the words "Christmas Kitchen." The handwriting was rounded and neat. Daniel brought down another labeled tree, then a smaller one marked Mason's favorites. His hand stopped on the last box. "Mom wrote that," Mason said. Daniel nodded. "She labeled everything." He gave a quiet laugh. "If I put something in the wrong box, she somehow knew." I didn't say anything. Daniel looked at the 3 boxes lined up on the floor. "I haven't opened these in 3 years." The room became very quiet. Mason sat beside the smallest box but didn't touch the lid. "We used some plastic decorations the last couple years," Daniel explained. "Small tree. Pre-lit. Easy to put away." I understood then. He hadn't stopped giving Mason Christmas entirely. He'd simply created a version that asked as little as possible from his memories. "Emily loved Christmas," Daniel continued. "It was the first time I heard her name. She started decorating the day after Thanksgiving. Music all day. Cookies everywhere. She made this house look completely ridiculous." Mason smiled. "It wasn't ridiculous. There were lights around the bathroom mirror. Those were good lights. Daniel laughed. His eyes remained on the boxes. She died in October 3 years ago. His voice softened. That first December without her, I couldn't open any of this. The next year, I told myself I would. Then the next. He looked at the boxes. Eventually, leaving them closed became easier. I looked at Daniel, then at Mason waiting beside the decorations his mother had packed away for the last time. Every instinct told me not to offer some polished sentence about moving on. Daniel didn't need permission from a man he'd met that afternoon to heal. He needed control over what happened next. So I sat on the floor across from him. Which box do you want to open first? Daniel looked at me as if he'd expected a different question. That's it. That's it. His gaze moved over the labels. Mason waited without speaking. Finally, Daniel reached for the box marked tree. His fingers rested on the cardboard lid for several seconds before he lifted it. The smell of old pine, tissue paper, and something faintly cinnamon filled the air. Inside were carefully wrapped ornaments, strands of lights, and folded red ribbon. Mason leaned closer, smiling. Daniel picked up the first ornament. A small wooden snowflake painted white around the edges. His expression changed, but he didn't put it back. Instead, he handed it to Mason. Your mom bought this the year you were born. Mason held it carefully. Daniel looked across the open box at me. For the first time that day, the sadness in his face was sharing space with something else. He reached inside again. All right, he said quietly. Let's see what else is in here. We carried the open box upstairs one careful armful at a time. Within 20 minutes, the living room began changing in ways that had almost nothing to do with decorations. Mason hung the wooden snowflake first, choosing the wide gap in the Fraser fir as though that space had been waiting specifically for it. Daniel untangled a strand of warm white lights while I tested another near the wall outlet. These worked 3 years ago, he said. That's exactly what people say before discovering Christmas lights have developed trust issues. Mason laughed from behind the tree. Ryan is right. Daniel looked at me. You've known my son for less than a day, and somehow I'm already outnumbered. I have excellent coalition building skills. You sell Christmas trees. Seasonally. The first strand flickered on, throwing warm points of light across Daniel's face. For a while, decorating became easy. Mason found ornaments and asked questions. Daniel answered them. A tiny wooden cabin came from a trip to Vermont. A glass cardinal had belonged to Emily's grandmother. A ridiculous silver star had been purchased at a gas station after Daniel forgot to pack a tree topper during their first Christmas away from home. Every ornament seemed to contain a story. With each one, Daniel became a little less careful about telling it. Then Mason reached into the bottom of the box and pulled out something wrapped in white tissue paper. Daniel saw it before I did. His hand stopped halfway through tying a ribbon to a branch. Mason, he said softly. Mason unfolded the tissue. Inside was a simple ceramic ornament painted deep red, with one name written across the center in white script. Emily. Nobody spoke. Mason held it with both hands and looked at his father. Where does this go? Daniel stared at the ornament. The warmth that had gradually returned to his expression disappeared behind something guarded. Maybe we should put that one back for now. Mason lowered his eyes. Why? It's getting late. But we're not done. Daniel rubbed one hand across the back of his neck. We don't have to finish everything tonight. Mason started folding the tissue around the ornament again. I watched Daniel. He'd opened the boxes. He'd told the stories. He'd made it farther into this Christmas than he'd probably expected. I didn't want to push him past the point he'd chosen for himself. So I kept my voice light. You don't have to decide where it goes tonight. Daniel looked at me. I nodded toward the ornament. It can stay out while you finish the tree. Or go back in the box. Either way is fine. No speech. No lesson. Just a choice. Daniel looked at Mason. Then at Emily's name. For several seconds, he said nothing. Finally, he held out his hand. Can I see it? Mason passed him the ornament. Daniel turned it over slowly. Then he looked toward the upper branches of the tree. Where do you think Mom would have put it? Mason's face lifted. Somewhere. Important. Daniel gave a small nod. He stepped toward the Fraser fir. The tree was too tall for Mason to reach the upper branches, so Daniel carefully looped the ribbon around a sturdy branch a little below the top. The red ceramic ornament settled among the warm lights. Emily's name was clearly visible. Daniel stood looking at it. His eyes shone, but he smiled. She'd complained that it's crooked. I glanced at the tree. The entire tree is crooked. Mason laughed. Daniel did too. Softly at first. Then, with enough warmth that the tension in the room finally loosened, we kept decorating. Not every ornament came out of the box. Nobody suggested it had to. By 8:30, the Fraser fir glowed beside the front window. Imperfect, slightly left-leaning, covered with pieces of a family history I had known nothing about that morning. Mason sat on the rug admiring our work while finishing the last of his hot chocolate. Daniel stood beside me with his arms folded. "Thank you," he said, "for helping with the tree, for not making tonight into something it wasn't." I looked at him. What was it? He watched the lights for a moment. "A start, maybe." I smiled. "A crooked start. You're never letting that go, are you?" "Absolutely not." A little later, I pulled on my coat and headed toward the front door. Mason called good night from the living room. Daniel walked me onto the porch. Snow covered the lawns in a thin white layer, and the neighborhood had gone quiet. "Ryan," he said before I reached my car. I turned. He seemed almost surprised by what he was about to say. "Are you busy next Saturday?" I smiled because this time Mason hadn't invited me. "That depends." "On what?" "Whether you need professional assistance with any more Christmas emergencies." Daniel laughed. "Coffee. Maybe the Christmas market downtown." He paused. "No emergency required." I looked through the front window at the glowing tree, then back at him. "Saturday sounds good." Daniel nodded. As I walked toward my car, I realized something had shifted. That afternoon, I'd been invited into their house because Mason wanted help decorating a Christmas tree. Now Daniel was asking me back because he wanted me there. The following Saturday, Daniel was already waiting outside the coffee shop when I arrived downtown. The first thing I noticed was that he looked different without the careful tension he'd carried at the tree lot. He wore a charcoal sweater beneath a dark winter coat, his hands wrapped around a paper cup. When he saw me crossing the sidewalk, he smiled before I even reached him. "You're early," I said. "Architect." "That explains nothing. We consider being 5 minutes early the same thing as being on time. Graphic designers consider deadlines more like suggestions. That explains several things about you." I laughed and accepted the coffee he held out to me. "You remembered my order?" "Medium roast, cream, no sugar." "That's mildly impressive. Don't make it a big deal." Mason was spending the morning with his grandmother, so for the first time, Daniel and I were together without him. I expected that to make conversation harder. Instead, we walked toward the Christmas market as though we'd done it before. Wooden booths filled the downtown square, selling candles, knitted scarves, ornaments, maple candy, and enough holiday decorations to illuminate a small airport. Christmas music drifted between the buildings while light snow settled on our shoulders. Daniel stopped at a booth covered in outdoor lights. "I need these." Need is a strong word. "The front porch looks unfinished. Last week you had no decorations." I've apparently become ambitious. He picked up a box of warm white lights. "Colored," I said. Daniel stared at me. "Absolutely not. It's Christmas. It's my house." That attitude is why your porch lacks joy. 10 minutes later, we left with 2 boxes of warm white lights and 1 box of colored lights that Daniel claimed he'd purchased only because I refused to stop arguing. That evening, I found myself back at the Brooks house. Daniel stood on the porch trying to make every strand perfectly straight. Mason had returned from his grandmother's and watched us through the window while eating popcorn. "You know people can see the lights from 20 feet away," I said. "They don't need to be mathematically aligned." Daniel adjusted. "Another clip. I can see them. You're standing 18 inches away. That doesn't make them less crooked. You bought a crooked Christmas tree. Under protest. You love that tree." Daniel looked through the window toward the Fraser fir glowing in the living room. Emily's red ornament was visible near the top. "I do," he admitted. "We finished just after sunset." The porch lights came on all at once. Warm white along the roofline. The colored strand wrapped around the railing. Mason opened the front door and declared it perfect. Daniel pretended not to notice that the colored lights were his son's favorite part. December began moving that way. Not through grand plans. Through ordinary invitations. Coffee became dinner after work. Dinner became an evening helping Mason make paper snowflakes. One Wednesday, Daniel texted to ask whether I knew how to fix a strand of lights. I arrived with replacement bulbs and discovered the lights were working perfectly. "They started working again," he said. "Convenient." "Very." Another night, we returned to the Christmas market because Mason wanted a wooden ornament shaped like a train. Daniel and I shared a bag of roasted almonds while Mason examined every booth with the seriousness of an art collector. I began learning small things about Daniel. He hated peppermint coffee. He loved old Christmas songs, but pretended he didn't. He always checked whether Mason had gloves before remembering his own. He became quieter whenever someone mentioned New Year's Eve. I noticed. I didn't ask. Daniel learned things about me too. I'd moved back to town 2 years earlier after spending most of my 20s in Chicago. I designed logos and packaging for small businesses. I could make exactly 4 dinners without embarrassing myself. I had a habit of humming when I concentrated, something I hadn't known until Daniel pointed it out. One Friday evening, we finished hanging a wreath above the Brooks fireplace. Mason had fallen asleep on the couch beneath a blanket. The house was unusually quiet. Daniel handed me a mug of hot chocolate and stood beside me near the tree. "He likes having you here," he said. "I like being here." Daniel looked at me for a moment longer than necessary. "I do too." Neither of us moved. The tree lights reflected against the windows. Outside, snow covered the yard beneath the colored porch lights he'd supposedly never wanted. Daniel looked toward Emily's ornament. I expected him to withdraw into that familiar silence. Instead, he smiled. I forgot December could feel like this. Like what? He turned toward me. For a second, he seemed to search for an answer that wouldn't reveal too much. Then he stopped trying. Like something I want to remember. The words changed the space between us. I could feel it in the silence that followed. In the way Daniel held my gaze. In the sudden awareness that we were standing close enough for neither of us to pretend this was only friendship built around Christmas decorations. His hand shifted slightly beside mine on the mantel, almost touching. Then Mason stirred on the couch. Daniel stepped back and picked up his coffee even though it had gone cold. I should get him upstairs. Of course. I pulled on my coat and left a few minutes later. At the end of the driveway, I turned back. Daniel was still standing in the doorway watching me go. He raised one hand. I waved back. What I couldn't know was that the moment Daniel admitted he wanted to remember this December was also the moment he became afraid of what remembering me might mean. Daniel didn't text me the next morning. That shouldn't have mattered. We'd never established a rule that Sunday required a message, and technically nothing had happened the night before. We'd stood beside a Christmas tree, talked, looked at each other for a few seconds too long. Then I'd gone home. Still, by Monday afternoon, the silence felt noticeable. On Tuesday, I sent him a photograph of a storefront display featuring so many colored lights that the building looked radioactive. I wrote that his porch could still be saved if he acted quickly. Usually, Daniel would have responded with some dry comment about visual restraint. This time, he sent only 3 words. "Very funny, Ryan." Wednesday passed. Then Thursday. The dinner we'd casually discussed for Friday disappeared without either of us mentioning it. Finally, Daniel called me that evening. "Hey," I said, trying to sound more relaxed than I felt. "Hey." His voice was careful. "I wanted to tell you this weekend might not work." "The market?" "Everything, probably. Work's gotten busy, and Mason has some things going on." The explanation sounded reasonable. That was almost what made it worse. "Sure," I said. "No problem." A pause followed. "Ryan, you don't owe me an explanation." "I know." But he sounded like he wanted to give one and couldn't. "Tell Mason I said hello." "I will." We ended the call. I stared at my phone longer than I wanted to admit. I could have called back. I could have asked what had changed between Friday night and Saturday morning. Instead, I remembered the unopened Christmas boxes. Daniel had spent 3 years protecting himself by avoiding doors he wasn't ready to open. I wasn't going to become another person pulling on the handle. Saturday came. I worked at Parker Family Trees from morning until sunset. The lot was busier than ever, filled with families making last-minute choices before Christmas. Every Fraser fir reminded me of Daniel's living room. Every red ribbon reminded me of Mason standing between 2 trees, trying to remember how his mother would have chosen. I hated how quickly those memories had become mine too. Near closing time, my aunt came out of the checkout shed holding an envelope. "Someone left this for you." "Who?" "Woman about 60. Silver hair." Said she was Mason's grandmother. My chest tightened. Inside the envelope was one of the red ribbons from the day Mason chose the tree. Folded around it was a small piece of paper in Daniel's neat handwriting. "I am sorry. I thought I was ready." That was all. I read it twice beneath the warm bulbs strung over the lot. My first reaction was disappointment. My second was understanding. Somehow that hurt more. Daniel wasn't telling me nothing had happened. He was telling me something had. And he'd become afraid of where it might lead. 3 days later, Mason's grandmother came back to the lot. I recognized her immediately from Daniel's description. Her name was Linda. She carried the easy confidence of someone who'd learned long ago not to waste time pretending everything was fine. I probably shouldn't interfere, she said after introducing herself. Then we're off to a promising start. She smiled. Daniel's always been stubborn. I noticed. Linda looked toward the rows of trees. Then back at me. I won't explain him to you. That's his job. I appreciated that immediately, but I thought you should know you didn't do anything wrong. I looked at the ribbon I'd tied around my wrist. Did he say that? No. She gave a small sigh. When Daniel gets scared, he usually gets quiet. December seems hard for him. It is. She paused. Harder than he tells people. I waited, but she didn't continue. Instead, she looked at me carefully. If he wants you to understand why, he needs to be the one who tells you. I nodded. I don't want him pressured. Good. Linda glanced toward the checkout shed. Pressure will send him in the opposite direction. Then she smiled faintly. Mason likes you. I like him too. So does Daniel. That surprised me. Linda lifted one hand before I could respond. That's the only part I'm giving you for free. Then she walked away. I stayed at the lot until the lights were turned off one row at a time. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't send another message. If he returned, I wanted it to be because he chose to. Not because loneliness, guilt, or his mother pushed him toward me. Christmas Eve arrived 4 days later. By 7 that night, nearly every tree was gone. Empty wooden stands dotted the snowy lot, and only a handful of Fraser firs remained beneath strings of golden lights. My aunt headed home while I stayed to close the shed. Snow fell lightly as I gathered loose red ribbons from the tables. I was reaching for the switch controlling the final row of lights when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned. Daniel stood at the entrance to the lot. Alone. No Mason. No tree to buy. No practical reason to be there. He wore the same dark coat from the day we met, snow resting across his shoulders. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel looked at the red ribbon in my hand. I was hoping I hadn't waited too long. I looked at him standing beneath the Christmas lights and realized I'd imagined this moment several different ways. None of them included him looking this uncertain. That depends, I said. On what? On what you came here for. Daniel glanced toward the nearly empty rows of trees. Not a Fraser fir. Good, because your options are getting limited. A small smile touched his face. Then it disappeared. Snow gathered on the shoulders of his coat while I waited beside the checkout shed. I wanted to make this easier for him, but I knew that if I supplied the words, he could hide behind mine. Daniel finally walked closer. Mason is with my mother tonight. She seems direct. You met her. I lifted the red ribbon tied around my wrist. She delivered your note. Daniel looked embarrassed. Of course she did. She didn't explain you. That made him look up. She said that part was your job. For a moment, Daniel said nothing. Then he nodded. She's right. He stopped a few feet away. Ryan, I'm sorry. You already wrote that. Writing it was easier. I figured. He looked toward the trees. When I told you I wanted to remember this December, I went home that night and realized how much of it already had you in it. He swallowed. The tree lot. The ornaments. Coffee. The market. Those ridiculous colored lights. You like those lights. That isn't the point. It needed to be said. This time he laughed. Only briefly. Then his eyes lowered. I looked at the tree after you left and thought about how happy I'd been that evening. He paused, and my first reaction was guilt. The word hung quietly between us. Because of Emily? Daniel nodded. She died in October 3 years ago. I remember. But our last real Christmas together was the December before that. His voice stayed steady, but the sadness in it was unmistakable. By the time her final December came around, she was already too sick for most of the traditions she loved. He looked toward the falling snow. We tried. For Mason, mostly. He rubbed his hands together against the cold. But that whole season felt like watching things disappear one at a time. The tree, the parties, the lights, the plans we'd always made without thinking. I didn't interrupt. Then she died the following October. Daniel's jaw tightened. After that, December stopped feeling like Christmas. He gave a small, humorless laugh. It felt like a calendar of everything I'd lost. Suddenly his silence around New Year's Eve made sense. Daniel looked back at me. For 3 years, I knew exactly who I was. I was Emily's husband. Then I was her widower. I was Mason's dad. Those roles made sense, even when everything else didn't. He took another step closer. Then you showed up. I stayed silent. And suddenly I was looking forward to things again. His eyes met mine. Not because Mason needed them. Because I wanted them. He exhaled. I started thinking about seeing you after Christmas. January. February. Ordinary Tuesdays that had nothing to do with trees or decorations. He shook his head slightly. That scared me more than anything. Why? His answer came slowly. Because it felt like I was building a life she wasn't part of. I looked at him for a moment before speaking. Daniel, when you hung Emily's ornament, did anybody ask you to take it down? No. Did having coffee with me make Mason stop talking about her? No. Did putting lights on the porch change who she was to you? He looked at me. No. Then maybe January doesn't have to either. Daniel was quiet. This isn't really about what you would ask me to do, he said. I know. His expression shifted. It's about what I think I'm supposed to do. Probably. Daniel let out a long breath. I spent 3 years thinking loving her meant I had to stay exactly where she left me. The words were barely above a whisper. I thought if I changed too much, if the house changed, if Christmas changed, then somehow I was letting go of her. I stepped closer. Not enough to touch him. Just enough that he didn't have to say the next part across a distance. I don't think loving somebody requires you to stop living. Daniel's eyes met mine. You really believe that? I think Emily's ornament is still on your tree. He nodded. I think Mason still tells stories about her. Another nod. And I think none of that stopped you from having coffee with me. A faint smile returned. Technically, you had coffee with me. Architects are exhausting. Graphic designers are imprecise. We both laughed. The tension finally softened. Daniel looked around the tree lot where we'd met less than a month earlier. I don't know what happens next. Neither do I. That doesn't bother you? Not knowing. I shook my head. I'd be more worried if you showed up with a 5-year plan. I'm an architect. We like plans. Then make a small one. How small? Tomorrow. Daniel thought about it. Christmas Day. That's generally what comes after Christmas Eve. My mother is coming over around noon. He paused. Mason has been asking whether you're coming. And what are you asking? That stopped him. I watched the question settle. For the first time, there was no child making the invitation for him. No Christmas tree requiring help. No broken lights providing an excuse. Daniel had to decide whether he wanted me in his home simply because he wanted me there. Come tomorrow, he said. His voice was quiet, but certain. Not because Mason asked. Not because my mother will make too much food. He held my gaze. Come because I want you there. Warmth moved through me despite the cold. Okay. Daniel's shoulders relaxed. He looked at the ribbon around my wrist. You kept it. Apparently I'm sentimental. Can I have it? I untied the ribbon and handed it to him. Daniel folded it once, then placed it carefully in his coat pocket. What are you going to do with it? I don't know yet. That sounds dangerously spontaneous. Don't tell anyone. We started walking toward the parking lot together. Behind us, the last rows of Christmas lights glowed over the remaining trees. Daniel hadn't arrived with promises about forever. I didn't need them. The important thing was simpler. The first time we met, Mason had chosen a tree because it reminded him of someone his family loved. Tonight, Daniel had returned to the same place and chosen something for himself. Before we reached my car, his hand brushed mine. He hesitated, then gently took it. I looked at him. Daniel smiled, nervous, but certain. And together, we kept walking. Christmas morning arrived, bright and cold, with fresh snow covering the sidewalks and sunlight flashing across every rooftop on my drive to Daniel's house. I'd spent 20 minutes standing in my apartment debating whether bringing something would make the invitation feel more complicated than it needed to be. Eventually, I settled on a box of cinnamon rolls from a neighborhood bakery and a bottle of sparkling cider. Simple. Safe. When I pulled into the driveway a few minutes before noon, the colored lights along the porch railing were still glowing even in daylight. I smiled before I reached the door. Mason opened it almost immediately. You came. I was invited. By Dad. Specifically by your dad. Mason looked past me toward Daniel, who was walking down the hallway. See? I told you he could do invitations. Daniel gave his son a patient look. Merry Christmas to you too. He turned to me. The expression in his blue eyes was warmer than I remembered from the night before. Merry Christmas, Ryan. Merry Christmas. For half a second, neither of us seemed sure what came next. Then Daniel stepped forward and hugged me. It was brief and comfortable. Something about being welcomed that simply made the nervousness I'd carried all morning disappear. You brought food, he said. noticing the box. I was told your mother makes too much. That information was accurate. Linda appeared from the kitchen. I heard that. You were supposed to. Lunch was louder than I expected. Linda had made ham, roasted potatoes, green beans, rolls, and enough dessert for twice the number of people sitting around the table. Mason narrated nearly every gift he'd opened that morning. Daniel argued with his mother about whether anyone needed a third serving of potatoes. I mostly listened, occasionally catching Daniel looking at me from across the table. Every time our eyes met, he smiled. After lunch, Mason disappeared into the living room to assemble a model train set while Linda insisted on handling the dishes herself. Daniel and I carried coffee into the living room. The Fraser fir still leaned slightly left beside the window, glowing beneath warm white lights. Emily's red ornament hung near the top exactly where Daniel had placed it. I noticed something new beneath it. The red ribbon from the tree lot had been tied into a small bow around the branch. You found a use for it, I said. Daniel followed my gaze. It seemed like the right place. Why there? He took a moment before answering. Because that ribbon is how this started. I looked at him. Technically, Mason had two. I know. Daniel smiled. He kept the other one. From across the room, Mason called, "Mine is in my room." Excellent hearing, I said. Selective hearing, Daniel replied. We sat on the couch, leaving an easy amount of space between us. Daniel looked toward the tree. Last night after I got home, I stood here for almost an hour, thinking, unfortunately, architect problem? Apparently. His smile faded into something thoughtful. I realized I kept treating happiness like it needed permission. I stayed quiet, like I needed some sign from Emily telling me it was okay to keep living differently. He looked toward the ornament. But I know what she wanted from Mason. She wanted him surrounded by people who cared about him. And she wanted me to be more than someone who worked, made dinner, and remembered to pay the electric bill. That last one is important. Daniel laughed. Very. Then he looked at me. I can't promise I'll never get scared again. I wouldn't believe you if you did. I might have days when this feels complicated. It is complicated. You're not making this speech easy. I didn't know there was a speech. His eyes softened. There was supposed to be. I set my coffee on the table. Then forget the speech. Tell me what you actually want. Daniel looked at the tree. Then back at me. I want to see you after Christmas. Good. I want January. And February. And ordinary Tuesdays. My chest tightened at the callback to the words he'd spoken the night before. Those can be arranged. And I want to take this slowly. He glanced toward Mason. Because he matters. Then back at me. And because I'm still figuring out how to let something new exist beside everything that came before it. Slow sounds good. Daniel reached across the space between us and took my hand. This time, there was no hesitation. I also want to do something I've been thinking about since last night. That sounds suspiciously planned. Ryan. I smiled. What? Can I kiss you? The question was gentle and direct. Yes. Daniel leaned closer and kissed me softly. It lasted only a moment. Warm. Careful. Carrying none of the urgency I'd once imagined romance was supposed to require. When he pulled back, he looked almost surprised by his own smile. Okay, he said quietly. Okay. I expected that to feel more complicated. Give yourself time. You're very talented at overthinking. Daniel laughed. From across the room, Mason looked up from his train set. What's funny? Ryan insulted my planning skills. That sounds right. Daniel shook his head while I tried not to laugh. Later, as afternoon sunlight filled the room, I looked at the tree again. Emily's ornament remained near the top. The red ribbon rested beside it. Nothing had been removed to make room for me. That was when I finally understood what Daniel was beginning to understand too. A new chapter didn't require tearing out the pages that came before it. Sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was simply keep writing. 1 year later, I stood beneath strings of golden lights at Parker family trees while Daniel argued that a perfectly symmetrical 8-foot Fraser fir was clearly the best tree on the lot. Absolutely not, I said. Daniel folded his arms. There's objectively nothing wrong with it. Exactly. It has no personality. You sell trees, Ryan. You don't conduct personality assessments. That sounds like something a man with terrible Christmas tree instincts would say. Daniel gave me the patient expression he'd perfected over the past year. Before he could answer, Mason called from 2 rows away. I found it. We followed his voice and discovered him beside a Fraser fir that leaned slightly to the right and had a wide gap between 2 upper branches. Daniel stared at it. Then he looked at me. I suppose resistance is pointless. You're learning. Mason tied a red ribbon around one branch. That small movement brought me back instantly to the first afternoon we met. The day he'd stood between two trees, trying to remember how his mother would have chosen. So much had changed since then, but not all at once. Daniel had been right when he said he needed to go slowly. January began with coffee and ordinary dinners. February brought movie nights and a disastrous attempt by Daniel to teach me how to ice skate. Spring meant Saturday soccer games, backyard cookouts, and the first time Daniel introduced me to one of his co-workers simply as the person he was seeing. By summer, I had a key to the Brooks house. Daniel insisted it was only because I had an irresponsible habit of arriving before he got home. That's what keys are for, I'd told him. That's not why I gave it to you, he'd answered. The smile afterward told me everything else. There were difficult days too. Emily's birthday came in April. Daniel grew quiet for nearly a week before finally asking if I'd go with him and Mason to the lake where the family used to picnic. I went. I didn't try to turn the day into something happier. I listened to stories about her, helped carry lunch, understood that loving Daniel meant making room for every version of his life, not only the parts that included me. By December, that no longer felt complicated. It simply felt true. We brought the new Fraser fir home that afternoon and set it beside the same living room window. Linda arrived with cookies and immediately criticized Daniel's method of positioning the tree stand. Mason insisted he was now old enough to handle the lights. I was assigned ornaments because, according to everyone else, it was the only job I could perform without starting an argument. The old Christmas boxes came upstairs again. This time, there was no dust on them. Daniel opened the box-marked tree without hesitation. The wooden snowflake went into Mason's hands. The gas station star made Daniel groan. Then he found the red ceramic ornament with Emily's name. He held it for a moment, then turned toward the tree. A year earlier, that ornament had stopped the entire room. Now Daniel smiled softly and hung it near the top. Still crooked, I said. The ornament or the tree? Both. Perfect, then. Mason disappeared upstairs and returned carrying something behind his back. We have one more. He handed Daniel a small box. Inside was a new wooden ornament shaped like a house. Painted across it were the words, Christmas, 1 year later. Beneath the words were 3 small, evergreen trees. Daniel ran his thumb over the lettering. Where did this come from? Grandma helped me order it. Linda looked extremely pleased with herself. Mason pointed toward the upper branches. Put it next to Mom's. Daniel looked at him carefully. You sure? Yes. Daniel hung the new ornament on the branch beside Emily's. They moved gently in the warm light, close enough to share the same glow without covering each other. I felt Daniel's hand find mine. He squeezed once. Later, after dinner, Linda left and Mason went upstairs to finish wrapping a gift he refused to let either of us see. Daniel and I stayed in the living room with the tree lights on and everything else dimmed. I used to think this room had 2 versions, he said. Before Emily died and after. And now I think there are just more chapters than I expected. I leaned my shoulder against his. Careful. That sounds suspiciously optimistic. You're a bad influence. Your mother likes me. That proves my point. Daniel laughed and reached toward a lower branch. I noticed 2 faded red ribbons tied together in a small bow. Where'd you get the second one? Mason gave me his this morning. Why? Daniel smiled. He said we didn't need separate ones anymore. I looked at the 2 ribbons. I remembered the boy who once held one in each hand because he couldn't decide which tree felt like home. Daniel slipped his arm around my shoulders. Emily's ornament remained near the top. The new ornament hung beside it. Nothing had replaced anything. The past was still here. It simply no longer required Daniel to live inside it. Outside, snow began falling over the colored porch lights he'd once insisted he didn't want. Inside, the crooked Fraser fir filled the room with the scent of pine. Daniel looked at me and smiled. Merry Christmas, Ryan. Merry Christmas. A year earlier, Mason had asked me to help choose a tree. None of us understood then that the real choice would belong to Daniel. He'd spent years believing love meant remaining exactly where loss had left him. In the end, he discovered that remembering someone and choosing tomorrow were never opposite things. And beneath the lights of another imperfect Christmas tree, with 2 red ribbons finally tied together, home no longer felt like something our lives had lost. It felt like something we were still allowed to build.